Good morning. Welcome to a very windy morning in Mildura. It's hot outside and the sky has clouded up. I'm inside my studio, as you can see. Today I'm reading you the final memory from Richardson Street, the fifth of 7 east-west streets that, together with 7 north-south streets, forms a grid inside which I lived most of my life. In 2008, I decided to walk down each of these 14 streets in order to retrieve whatever memories would arise from my life in the decades past. These memories would then be written down, collected in a book and published in 2008. I'm now reading you the last memory that arose as I walked down Richardson, the 5th Street. Its colour is blue. 269 Richardson Street. When the children starting attending first grade at Princes Hill Primary, a few of us parents got together and organised a roster to pick them up. One afternoon a week, one of us would pick them all up and take them home to play together until they were collected much later in the afternoon by the other parents. It was much cheaper than after-school care and seemed to foster closer ties between both the children and the grown-ups. The principal worked fine, except on those few occasions when someone would forget to check if everyone had been picked up, and unintentionally a child would be left behind in the playground. It happened to one of my daughters one day. She had been reading her favourite book inside the library and Bob completely missed her. She told me later that she had suddenly looked up from her book only to realise that the sky outside had somewhat darkened. The librarian must have missed her too, as Emma was reading in a dark corner, and when the main door was locked, she found herself trapped inside the school. She waited quietly till dark, believing somebody would eventually come, but she became more and more anxious as time went by. Eventually, one of the teachers returned to the school to pick up something she'd forgotten and just happened to see Emma's little figure sitting inside the darkened library. She unlocked the door and asked her what she was doing there. Emma told her what had happened, and the teacher took her to her own home nearby. Then she phoned me. I was still at work. When I eventually drove up to the teacher's house at 269 Richardson Street, Emma was waiting outside, leaning on the wrought iron fence, listening for the sound of my car in the chilly gloom of an autumn dusk. I thanked the teacher for looking after my daughter, and she told me how horrified she was that someone could have missed the pickup of a child. I didn't know how to explain or what else to say to her. We wished her a good night and we left. As Emma got into the car, she said quietly, "I knew you'd come, Dad." For the ears of a father, can a child ever utter sweeter words? I thought of how easily she may have panicked if the teacher had not returned. I thought of how vacant Bob must have been that day, how vague in discharging as significant a responsibility as picking up a child from school. When I asked him on the phone later that night what had happened, I was met by a long silence, and he then hung up the phone. We have never talked about it since that day, and it seemed useless to ever ask again. Emma has never forgotten that day. She has reminded me a number of times over the years about the day she was abandoned at school after dark. She asks in an amused way, as though it's inconceivable to her that something like that could ever happen. And she's right. These days, it seems impossible to me that she or any of the other parents would ever forget to pick up a child after school. I don't know whether it's because today parents are more responsible or whether times have changed for the worse and everyone is far more circumspect and concerned about the vulnerability of their children. Nevertheless, from here, it seems as though the haze of self-obsession that pervaded everything back then rendered this all so unfocused. I'm not sure I can say I was any clearer than Bob regarding my own responsibilities. I look at my children and the way they parent their precious offspring, and I wonder where their wisdom comes from. Not from me, not from any of us. Perhaps it's their own children that inspire and instruct them. Perhaps each generation's little ones challenge their parents' awareness so consistently that the adults must, in time, simply meet each new provocation with an increasingly adequate response. Though, of course, we too were challenged, I don't believe we ever registered the fineness of what our children asked of us and the potential each of their questions had for our growth as parents and our development as individuals. They, unlike us, seem to be registering this potential in their own children's questions just fine. That ends the memories that arose in Richardson Street. The 6th East-West Street is Grattan Street, and this is the 4th memory. Grattan Street is indigo. This memory is green. The corner of Grattan and Rathdowne. I can hardly walk by without stopping at this corner when I think what happened here and its effect on my life. But my response might be better understood and accepted by those who acknowledge that we cannot ever know anything or can even remember much. We can only imagine. I was 23 years old, and on an early spring morning of 1970, I was walking along leafy Grattan Street alongside the young woman I then believed I loved. When we reached the corner of Grattan and Rathdowne Street, we turned to face south. Before us lay the splendid, untouched morning greenness of the Carlton Gardens. At that moment, she suddenly turned towards me and quietly said, "We should get married." I held her by the waist and lifted her high up into the blue spring air. I have not yet put her down. My hands cannot seem to release her, and somehow we are still spinning together on the innocent pavement. Until tomorrow, when I continue reading you accounts of what arose when I walked down Grattan Street, the 6th of 7 East-West Streets. We're getting close to the end of the tertiary world. The wind continues to rise. Until tomorrow.